The sun was setting over the small, quiet cemetery, its warm golden light casting long shadows on the rows of tombstones. The air was thick with the scent of fresh earth and the quiet murmur of the wind. For most, it would have been an ordinary evening, but for Marie, it was anything but. She stood there, motionless, staring at the grave that held all that was left of her only son. The pain in her chest felt like it might swallow her whole, a constant ache she couldn't escape, no matter how much time passed. It had been 2 years since the accident, the moment her world shattered into pieces. She could still hear the screech of tires, the crash, and the desperate call of her name from her son. Before everything went silent, her heart never fully recovered. From that day, she never expected to bury her child. A mother's love should outlive their children. But life had cruelly torn that expectation apart. And now, every time she stood before his grave, the flood of grief was as raw as it had been that first night. But today, as she knelt beside the stone, something was different. There was a strange stillness in the air, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. Marie hadn't told anyone she was coming to the cemetery today. She didn't know why, but she felt an overwhelming need to be there, as if the grave were calling to her, urging her to come and listen. Perhaps it was just the overwhelming grief playing tricks on her mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching her. With trembling hands, she reached for the small, faded photograph that had once been pinned to the gravestone, the one that showed her son's bright, carefree smile. As her fingers brushed against the surface, a shiver ran through her spine, and a gust of wind seemed to push the photo further into her hand. She glanced around, her breath caught in her throat. The wind had picked up unexpectedly, swirling around her in strange patterns. But there was no sign of anyone else, no footsteps, no sounds. Then just as quickly, the breeze died down. Marie felt a chill that wasn't from the cold air. She glanced around again, but this time, something caught her eye. A figure, a shadow, no more than a blur at first, standing just beyond the gravestone. It was far away enough that it could have been a trick of the light, a figment of her exhausted mind, but something about the way it moved felt too real, too deliberate. She froze. Her heartbeat quickened as she tried to focus on the figure. It was slender, tall, and wrapped in the kind of darkness that didn't seem to belong. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way anyone she knew could be. The figure wasn't facing her directly, but there was something so familiar about it, something that made her feel as though she had seen it before, even though she couldn't place where or when. It wasn't until the figure moved, its head turning slightly, that she saw the detail that made her blood run cold. The figure wasn't alone. Another shape seemed to materialize beside it, a shadow that lingered in the corner of her vision. This second shape was smaller, almost childlike, but somehow just as foreboding. Her heart pounded louder in her ears. She blinked, and the figures were gone, as though they had never been there at all. Confused, trembling, Marie stood up and took a few shaky steps back, the ground beneath her feet feeling suddenly unstable. She turned to leave but found herself unable to pull away from the grave. Something was drawing her back, something she couldn't explain. There was a whispering voice in her mind, one that kept telling her to stay, to look closer, to search for the truth. Her son had died so suddenly, so violently. They hadn't even been able to give him a proper funeral, just a quick service, and then they buried him. But she had always believed that somehow, some way, he was still out there. Maybe it was denial, maybe it was hope. But the connection between mother and child, she thought, could never truly be severed. She believed deep down that one day, in some form, he would come back to her. That today might be the day she would feel him near her again. She stepped forward, closer to the grave, reaching out as if something invisible was calling to her from the depths of the earth. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of unspoken emotions. Her eyes burned as the sting of fresh tears threatened to break free. She wanted to scream, to ask why. Why had he been taken from her? Why couldn't she hear his voice anymore? But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood there, frozen, waiting. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The earth seemed to hum, vibrating softly like a heartbeat. Marie looked down, and for the briefest of moments, she could have sworn she saw a faint light flicker from the grave itself. She gasped, taking a hesitant step back. Was this really happening? Was it possible that… No, it couldn't be. The possibility was too much to bear, too strange to comprehend. Yet, the pull of that light, that sensation, was undeniable. Then came the sound, a soft, familiar voice, a voice she hadn't heard in 2 years, called her name. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her as the voice echoed in the air around her. Mom! The voice was unmistakable. It was his voice, her son's voice, but he was gone. He couldn't be here. She had buried him. She had… Her thoughts were interrupted by the voice once again. Mom, I'm here. Marie turned around slowly, her heart racing in her chest. The world seemed to have gone still again, the graveyard eerily silent, but as she turned, there was no sign of anyone. Just the same empty tombstones, the same silent graveyard. And yet, something was different. The tension hung in the air, thick and unrelenting, as the soft whisper of her son's voice lingered in her mind. But where was he? What was happening? She had to find out. She had to know. Her search was just beginning. Marie's heart raced as she scanned the empty graveyard, searching for any sign of movement, any trace of the voice that had called her. The wind picked up again, but this time it felt different, colder, sharper, like it carried the weight of 1,000 whispered secrets. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the gravestone, as though the act might somehow anchor her, make sense of the madness she was feeling. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions. Had she imagined it? Could it have been a trick of the wind or the sound of something else in the distance? But no, it was unmistakable. She had heard her son's voice, clear as day, the same voice that had once called out to her in laughter, in pain, in love. But now it was gone. Was it a sign, a message from beyond, or was she losing her grip on reality? Marie's life had been a quiet one before the accident. She had been a mother, a wife, a woman content with the simple joys of family. Her son, Ethan, had been her whole world. He was the kind of boy who could light up a room with his smile, who asked questions about everything, whose curiosity seemed limitless. He was kind-hearted, always looking out for others. He was everything a mother could hope for. Then, one cold winter evening, it all changed. The call came late, too late. The familiar sound of her husband's voice had been filled with a panic she'd never heard before. Marie, there's been an accident. Ethan's… The words were jumbled, rushed, and unrecognizable. The details of that night were blurred in her mind, but the image of the police officers at her door, their faces grave, would forever haunt her. The crash had been brutal, a sudden and violent collision that took Ethan's life instantly. They said it was a freak accident. No one was at fault. Just one of those tragic things that happen for no reason at all. But Marie couldn't accept it. She couldn't accept that her son, her precious boy, was just gone. The world had continued on, as if nothing had changed. But for her, Nothing would ever be the same. Her husband, David, tried to comfort her, tried to make her see that time would heal the pain. But time had only made the wound deeper. The silence in their home was deafening. Without Ethan's laughter, without his energy, without his light, David, too, had retreated into himself, burying his grief beneath his work and his silence. They were both there, physically present, but emotionally distant. Neither of them knew how to cope, how to heal. It was easier for them to just pretend, to carry on as if life could go back to normal. But for Marie, there was no normal without Ethan. Then came the dreams. At first, it was just an occasional whisper in the dark, a fleeting glimpse of his face, a memory that would dissolve the moment she awoke. But as the months passed, they became more vivid. She would dream of him standing in their living room, just as he had before, his eyes filled with that familiar, mischievous spark. In the dreams, he would always be just out of reach, as if she could never quite hold him again. And every time, she would wake up with the sharp sting of loss, a deep ache in her chest that would last the entire day. Marie tried everything. She went to therapy. She read every book on grief she could find. She even spoke to a medium, someone who claimed to communicate with the dead, but none of it helped. None of it brought her any closer to understanding what had happened or how to move forward. It was during one of her visits to the cemetery, months after the accident, that she first noticed something strange. She had come to sit by Ethan's grave, as she often did, speaking to him as though he was still there, sharing the moments of her day, telling him about the things she wished she could tell him in person. That day, as she sat there in the quiet, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, and the earth beneath her feet seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't explain. It was a sensation she couldn't ignore, one that tugged at her like a thread pulling her deeper into something she wasn't ready for. But she couldn't pull away. Not today. She felt an undeniable urge to stay, to search for something. And that's when the figure appeared, the shadow she had seen out of the corner of her eye. At first, it had seemed like nothing more than a trick of the light, but now, with every passing second, it felt more real, more present. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just a figment of her imagination. Something was happening. Something was trying to reach her. And just as quickly as the figures appeared, they disappeared. The graveyard returned to its eerie silence, the wind settling as if nothing had ever happened. Marie's mind raced, trying to piece together what she had just experienced. Could it have been a sign? Was Ethan trying to reach her? And if so, why now? Why here? As she stood there, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, she suddenly felt the ground shift beneath her. It was subtle at first, just a faint tremor in the earth, but then it grew stronger. Her knees buckled, and she had to grab hold of the gravestone to steady herself. The hum in the air intensified, vibrating through her very bones. The earth seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heart, a beat that was both comforting and terrifying. At once, the voice returned, but this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was louder, clearer, as though Ethan was right there, standing beside her. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I need you to listen." Marie's breath caught in her throat. She turned, her eyes scanning the graveyard, desperate to find him, desperate to understand what was happening. But all she saw was emptiness. Still, she could feel him, feel his presence, as though he were close enough to touch. And then, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the light. It was tall, indistinct, its features obscured, but as it moved closer, Marie's heart stopped. The figure seemed to radiate an energy she couldn't explain, an energy that seemed both familiar and foreign. It reached out, and for a moment, she thought she saw a face. But then, the figure spoke. "It's not what you think. He's not gone." The ground beneath her seemed to tremble, and she felt herself fall into the darkness, pulled deeper into the mystery she could no longer ignore. Who was this figure? What had happened to Ethan? And why had he been trying to reach her all this time? The answers, it seemed, were just beyond her grasp. The figure stepped closer, its presence undeniable, and the air around Marie grew thick with tension. Her heart raced, and a cold sweat ran down her back. She couldn't breathe. She was frozen, her body locked in place by a mixture of fear and disbelief. Was this really happening? Was her son's voice not a trick of the mind, but a real, tangible call from beyond? Was this figure the answer she had been searching for? Or was it something darker, something meant to deceive her? "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt like they didn't belong to her, as if they came from somewhere deep within her, desperate to understand. The figure didn't answer immediately. It took another step closer, and for the first time, the air seemed to part, revealing something that made Marie's stomach drop. A face. The features were still obscured by shadows, but one thing was unmistakable. It was her son's eyes, Ethan's eyes. Her breath caught in her throat as a wave of recognition and grief washed over her. "I'm sorry, Mom," the figure said again, its voice softer now, almost gentle. "I had to go, but I'm still here. I've always been here." Marie's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in shock. Her mind was spinning. She had been convinced that she had buried her son, that she had said her final goodbye, and yet here was something that felt like him, something that defied all logic and reason. "Ethan," she whispered, unable to hold back the tears. "Is it really you?" The figure nodded, its shape flickering in and out like a mirage. It looked almost as though it were fading, only to return more clearly with each passing moment. It wasn't solid, not quite real, but it was close enough that Marie's heart couldn't deny it. "I didn't die the way they told you," the figure confessed, its voice filled with a mixture of sorrow and regret. "The accident. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't just some random tragedy. Someone hurt me. They didn't want me to tell the truth, but I couldn't keep it from you. I couldn't leave you in the dark." Marie's mind was reeling. Every instinct told her to stand up, to run, to call for help, but something about the figure held her in place. It was Ethan. It had to be. The way he spoke, the way he looked at her, it was all him. But the words, the confession, was something she couldn't ignore. Something didn't add up. "What do you mean? What happened? Who did this to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. With desperation, the figure hesitated, and the air grew even heavier, the weight of its words pressing down on her chest. Then, in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of 100 unspoken truths, it spoke again. "Dad!" It was Dad. He didn't mean to, but he was behind it. The crash. He was driving, but he wasn't himself. He was angry. "I tried to stop him, but I couldn't. I didn't want to believe it either, but I have to tell you the truth." Marie's world tilted on its axis. David, her husband, the love of her life, the man she had spent years grieving with, the man who had also lost their son, had been involved in the death she had never truly understood. Her mind refused to accept it, yet the truth, no matter how impossible, was right in front of her. She stared at the figure, still struggling to process the revelation. "How can this be? How could he hurt you?" Her voice cracked with disbelief, but deep down, there was a quiet knowing that wouldn't let go. the cracks in her own marriage, the distance, the silence. It all made sense now. She had never known the full story. She had never known what had been brewing beneath the surface. The figure seemed to shrink, its form flickering again, as though it were about to disappear entirely. I never wanted to hurt you, Mom. I didn't want to leave you like this. But you need to know what happened. You need to see the truth, even if it's painful. Tears streamed down Marie's face, but they were no longer tears of sorrow. They were tears of something else, something like clarity, understanding. The loss had been unbearable, but now, in this strange, impossible moment, she finally had the answers she had spent so long searching for. Her son had not left her alone. In the dark, he had been trying to reach her, to guide her, even from beyond the grave. The figure, now fading more rapidly, took one last step toward her. It reached out, its hand brushing against her cheek, as though to reassure her that everything was going to be okay, that she was not alone. I love you, Mom. I'll always be with you. And then, just like that, it was gone. The figure, the presence, the voice, all of it vanished in an instant. The graveyard fell silent again, the air still and cold. Marie stayed kneeling, her body trembling, but her mind clearer than it had ever been. She could no longer deny the truth. No matter how much it hurt, the man she had married, the man she had trusted, had played a part in her son's death. But even as the shock of the revelation settled in, she realized something. It wasn't her fault. She couldn't carry the weight of his actions. She couldn't change what had happened. But she could decide what came next. And so, with a heavy heart and newfound strength, she stood. She looked at Ethan's grave one last time, her grief now intertwined with the truth. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't stay stuck in the past. She had to confront David, to face the truth, no matter how painful. It wasn't just about justice. It was about closure, about honoring Ethan's memory, and finally understanding the reasons behind the tragedy that had torn their family apart. As she turned to leave the graveyard, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Ethan's presence still lingered, not in a way that haunted her, but as a reminder that love never truly dies. The truth had set her free, and now, for the first time in a long time, she could breathe again.